Imagine Spain in the year 1661, a kingdom that had once ruled the seas, its galleons carrying silver and gold from the New World, its armies feared across Europe, its rulers descended from one of the most powerful dynasties in history, the House of Habsburg. But behind the grandeur, shadows lingered. The empire was no longer in its golden age. The economy faltered, wars drained the treasury, and beneath the polished surface of royal palaces, a terrible truth festered. The Hapsburgs had weakened themselves through centuries of inbreeding. Into this world came Charles II of Spain, a child destined to inherit not just a crown, but centuries of frailty, superstition, and decline. For generations, the Spanish Hapsburgs had married their cousins, nieces, and uncles, believing that by keeping their blood pure, they were preserving divine legitimacy. What they preserved instead were genetic weaknesses. Charles was the product of this tangled lineage. His father, King Philip IV, had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. This made Charles both their son and the child of a family tree that had grown in upon itself, curling like twisted roots. Physicians who attended his birth noted at once that he was frail. His head was unusually large, his jaw misshapen, and his limbs weak. He could not feed properly without difficulty. The court whispered. Some called him cursed, others bewitched. In the Spanish court, infants were expected to embody the strength of the dynasty. Charles did not. He was constantly ill, plagued by fevers, digestive problems, and weakness that left him unable to thrive. It was said that he did not learn to walk until he was nearly 8 years old. His speech was delayed, slurred, and often incomprehensible. His tutors despaired of teaching him to read or write. From his earliest days, Charles seemed less like a prince and more like a fragile relic of a fading house. Yet to his mother, Mariana of Austria, he was precious. She shielded him from criticism, cloaked him in silks, and ensured that no one dared speak openly of his condition. The Spanish people had long believed that kings carried divine favor. When Charles was born weak and sickly, many believed that something darker was at play. Was it a curse? A punishment from God for Spain's sins? Or the result of witchcraft? Priests were summoned to bless him. Holy water was sprinkled over his cradle. Relics of saints were placed near his bed. The court treated his every illness not just as a medical matter, but as a spiritual one. And so from his first days, Charles lived under a cloud of superstition. A child not just of flesh and bone, but of rumor, prayer, and whispered fear. Charles's father, Philip IV, had been a king of immense presence, ruling Spain for more than 40 years. By the time Charles was born, however, Philip was weary and aged, drained by endless wars with France and the Dutch, burdened by a treasury on the brink of collapse. He saw in his son not the promise of renewal, but the fragility of decline. Still, Philip prayed that with time, Charles might strengthen, that the dynasty might endure. But fate would not be so kind. Philip died when Charles was only 4 years old, leaving the frail boy as king of Spain, his mother Mariana as regent, and the empire in uncertain hands. Charles was proclaimed king at the age of 4. Trumpets sounded, banners unfurled, and Spain bowed before its new monarch. Yet all who looked upon him saw not strength, but weakness. He was carried into public ceremonies, unable to walk unaided. His jaw jutted forward, his tongue too large for his mouth, making speech difficult. His eyes often appeared vacant, his movements sluggish. The people of Spain whispered. Some pitied him. Others feared what his rule would mean for the empire. The name that would cling to him all his life began to take shape. El Hechizado, the Bewitched King. Spain in the 17th century was no longer the unstoppable empire of Charles V or Philip II. Silver shipments from the Americas had dwindled. Wars in Europe had drained the treasury. The once mighty armada was but a shadow of its former self. Now, with a frail child on the throne, the empire's enemies, France, England, the Dutch watched eagerly, for they saw not a king, but an opportunity. Charles, too young to understand, became a symbol of decline. His body carried the marks of a dynasty undone by its own choices, and his reign would soon carry the weight of Spain's failing power. Thus began the tragic life of Charles II of Spain, born frail into a dynasty that had once ruled half the known world. His story was one of curses and superstition, of decline and desperation. He was the last of the Spanish Hapsburgs, and his birth marked not renewal, but the beginning of an end. As he grew, his frailties would become more visible, his reign more precarious, and his empire more fragile. But for now, he remained a child cloaked in silks, watched over by priests and nurses, a king in name but not in power. The world would soon learn that the Bewitched King was not merely a figure of pity, but a monarch whose weaknesses would set Europe ablaze in wars of succession. From the moment Charles II was placed in the royal cradle, his life was shaped by fragility. His body seemed too weak for the weight of his crown, too delicate for the demands of empire. By the time he reached his earliest years, it was clear he was not like other children. He struggled to hold his head upright. His legs bent awkwardly beneath him, refusing to support his body. His jaw jutted forward, his tongue too large, making speech thick and difficult. In the vast halls of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, Charles was often seen propped up by attendants. His small body swaddled in silks, carried more often than he walked. Every step was an effort, every word a struggle. With Philip IV dead, the boy king's mother, Queen Mariana of Austria, became regent. Fiercely protective, she refused to allow her son's weaknesses to be openly acknowledged. When courtiers whispered of his condition, she silenced them. When rumors of curses and witchcraft spread, she summoned priests and theologians to pray for him. In public ceremonies, Charles was dressed in jewels and embroidered robes, his frailty hidden beneath layers of finery. But behind closed doors, Mariana knew the truth. She hovered over her son constantly, instructing nurses to shield him, commanding physicians to invent remedies, and arranging tutors who often despaired at the boy's inability to concentrate. Though Mariana tried to shield her son, the court of Madrid was alive with whispers. Nobles spoke in hushed tones of his inability to walk until nearly 8 years old, of his sluggish mind, of his strange appearance. Some claimed he was bewitched, cursed by enemies of Spain. Others murmured that God himself had marked the boy as a sign of Spain's punishment for its pride. A few dared to speak of the truth, that centuries of inbreeding had produced a king unfit to rule. Yet none of these whispers could be spoken openly. In the presence of the Queen, Charles was to be honored, praised, and bowed before as king. But in the corridors of the palace, the name spread quietly. El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Charles's tutors faced an impossible task. They tried to teach him reading, writing, and statecraft, but his concentration was fleeting, his comprehension slow. He often seemed distracted, his eyes wandering as though he could not grasp the meaning of words placed before him. When lessons became too difficult, Charles would weep or grow silent, staring blankly as though the world itself were too heavy to bear. His tutors, frustrated, would leave the chamber shaking their heads, only to be reminded by Mariana that their duty was not to succeed, but to try endlessly, for the king must at least appear to learn. Charles's childhood was not filled with games or friendships. He had few companions, for most children of his age could not relate to him. His illnesses, his weakness, and his mother's overprotection kept him apart. In his place, priests and confessors became his constant company. They whispered prayers over him, warned of the devil's tricks, and told him that only through God's mercy could he survive. Charles came to believe he was indeed cursed. Whenever his body failed him, and it failed him often, he wondered if witches had hexed him, or if God had marked him for suffering. Sickness was Charles's constant companion. Fevers gripped him suddenly, leaving him shivering and pale. His stomach could not keep food. Meals were followed by hours of weakness and pain. He often remained in bed for days at a time, surrounded by physicians who prescribed endless tonics. Herbs, powders, oils, all to little effect. Mariana ordered reliquaries placed by his bedside, believing that holy relics could heal where medicine could not. At times, Charles was forced to swallow ground pearls or crushed gemstones, remedies thought to draw out evil. Each time he recovered from an illness, it was treated as a miracle. Each time he fell ill again, it was seen as proof of enchantment. Despite his weakness, Charles was required to appear in public. On feast days, processions, and court gatherings, he was dressed in velvet and gold, his thin frame hidden beneath layers of regal fabric. He was paraded before the people of Madrid, seated on a throne too large for him, his pale face framed by jewels. Trumpets blared, banners waved, and the crowd shouted, "Viva el Rey!" But many in the crowd stared in silence. Some bowed their heads not in reverence, but in pity, for they saw not a boy king, but the broken future of an empire. By the time Charles reached his 10th year, Spain's nobility grew uneasy. A child so weak, so frail, so unfit. How could he one day govern the vast empire? Mariana clung to hope, insisting that with age, Charles would grow stronger. Physicians reassured her with hollow words, promising that time would heal. But the truth was evident. Charles was not improving. The Spanish court began to fear the inevitable. A king unable to rule, an empire in decline, and enemies circling like vultures. The fate of Spain seemed bound to the frail body of a boy who could barely walk, barely speak, and barely understand the world around him. Charles II's childhood was one of shadows of illness, superstition, and whispers of doom. Where other princes learned the arts of war and politics, he learned only pain and prayer. Where others built strength and wisdom, he built only frailty and fear. The empire waited, watching the child who would be king, knowing that his weakness was not just his own, but the weakness of Spain itself. And as Charles grew, the weight of that truth would press heavier upon him and upon all of Europe. In 1675, Charles II reached the age when boyhood slipped reluctantly into manhood. At just 14 years old, he was declared old enough to rule in his own right. Yet everyone at court knew the crown was far heavier than his shoulders could bear. His mother, Queen Mariana, reluctantly stepped back from formal regency, though in practice she still guided every decision. Ministers bowed before Charles, presented him with state papers, and addressed him as Majestad. But it was all theater. The boy king, pale and uncertain, signed documents he barely understood, and repeated words written for him by others. The kingdom proclaimed its sovereign, but in truth, Spain had only the shadow of a king. Spain was no longer the titan of Europe it had once been. This golden age had faded. The silver fleets from the New World dwindled, wars had drained the treasury, and provinces rebelled against Madrid's distant authority. Now, with Charles II as king, the decline became visible to all. Foreign ambassadors wrote home of a monarch who could not walk without stumbling, who slurred his words, who sat blankly in audiences as others debated the matters of empire. The empire, still vast on maps, was hollow within. Its strength depended on a ruler who could not rule. Power flowed not from Charles, but from those around him. Ministers, confessors, generals, and above all, his mother Mariana, controlled the decisions of the crown. Factions at court schemed endlessly. One group sought influence through the Queen Mother. Another pushed for their candidate as Charles's favorite. Each faction whispered that they alone could protect the king from curses, from enemies, from the weight of rule. Charles himself, often confused by these arguments, withdrew into silence. He became more an object of struggle than a participant. He was the symbol of kingship, but never the wielder of it. Charles's health did not improve with age. His illnesses continued, leaving him weak and dependent. Priests convinced him that his struggles were not natural but the work of witches and demons. He became obsessed with the idea of enchantments. He ordered exorcisms, demanded investigations into sorcery, and spent long hours in chapels, pleading before saints to lift the curse upon him. Rather than ruling, he prayed. Rather than commanding armies, he sought holy water and relics. Spain's king, in the eyes of many, had become a prisoner not only of weakness, but of superstition. Whenever Charles appeared before the people, the strain was visible. In processions, he rode pale and hunched. In ceremonies, his words were slurred and halting. Crowds greeted him with shouts of "Viva el Rey!" Yet behind the cheers lay pity and fear. Mothers whispered to their children not to stare too long at the king. Foreign visitors reported back to their courts with disbelief. This was the ruler of Spain, the empire once feared across Europe. His very presence in public was both a necessity and a humiliation. Despite his frailty, Charles was still a king, and kings were expected to provide heirs. In 1679, at 18 years old, he was married to Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of the powerful King Louis XIV of France. The marriage was celebrated with splendor, seen as a chance to renew Spain's strength. Yet in private, it quickly became a source of sorrow. Marie-Louise was young, vibrant, and beautiful, but Charles's health and weakness made their union difficult. Year after year passed without children. Court whispers grew louder. Was the king cursed? Was his body too broken to produce an heir? The survival of the Habsburg dynasty hung by a thread. Outside Spain, Charles II became the subject of ridicule. Pamphlets and letters described him as a king more dead than alive, a monarch ruled by priests and women. Foreign kings debated who would inherit his crown, even while he lived. The War of Spanish Succession had not yet begun, but its seeds were sown in the weakness of Charles himself. For every banquet he attended, every treaty he signed, foreign ambassadors saw not authority but decline. Spain, once feared, was now mocked, and its king was the clearest symbol of decay. Behind the gilded walls of the Alcazar, Charles lived in loneliness. His marriage, though affectionate at times, brought him little joy. His body, constantly ill, left him exhausted. His spirit, consumed by fears of curses, left him anxious. He wandered through endless corridors of the palace, staring at tapestries of battles his ancestors had won, knowing he could never achieve the same. Where others had built empires, he could barely stand. In silence, the young king carried not only his crown but the sorrow of knowing he was unfit for it. Thus passed the early years of Charles II's rule, a reign in name but not in power. The king could not govern, could not lead armies, could not secure heirs. He was a monarch in title only, his weakness visible to all. His reign haunted by curses, pity, and the growing shadow of Spain's decline. Spain was not yet at war, but already it was breaking. And at its heart stood a man who bore the title of king, yet never the strength of one. When Charles II married Marie-Louise of Orleans in 1679, hope spread across Spain. The young French princess was radiant, lively, and intelligent. Courtiers whispered that perhaps she would bring vitality to a monarchy weighed down by sorrow. For a moment it seemed possible. Marie-Louise rode horses, laughed easily, and lit up the somber court of Madrid with her presence. Wherever she went, crowds adored her. Spain longed for joy, and she gave it. But behind the grand facade, the marriage soon revealed its fractures. Years passed, and no child was born. At first, the court was patient. They prayed, they reassured themselves, they waited. But as months turned into years, whispers filled the palace halls. Some blamed Marie-Louise, accusing her of being cold or cursed. Others blamed Charles, whose frail body and weak constitution made the possibility of fatherhood uncertain. Physicians prescribed potions and rituals. Astrologers consulted the stars. Priests muttered prayers at midnight. Nothing worked. By the mid-1680s, despair had settled. The Spanish crown, the very survival of the Habsburg line, was slipping away. As hope dwindled, superstition grew. Charles, already convinced he was cursed, became obsessed with the idea that dark forces had bewitched him. Confessors whispered that witches had tied knots to prevent him from conceiving children. Exorcists were summoned to perform rituals over his body. Holy relics were pressed to his chest. He drank water blessed by monks, ate herbs said to break enchantments, and submitted to bizarre ceremonies. The King of Spain, the ruler of an empire stretching across oceans, sat trembling in candlelit chambers, convinced that invisible forces ruled his fate. For Marie-Louise, life at court became unbearable. She was blamed for her childlessness, accused of sorcery, and watched constantly. Though she and Charles shared moments of tenderness, her letters revealed a woman trapped in sadness and longing for her homeland. She sought solace in small joys, riding horses, speaking French with her ladies, enjoying gardens. Yet her laughter faded as pressure mounted. By 1689, after 10 years of marriage, her health declined under the weight of grief. That year, she died suddenly at the age of 26. Some whispered from poison, others from sorrow. Charles was left alone, heartbroken, convinced her death was yet another curse upon him. Spain could not remain without the prospect of heirs. Within a year, Charles was remarried, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a powerful Catholic family. Maria Anna was strong-willed, politically savvy, and ambitious. Unlike the gentle Marie-Louise, she entered the marriage determined to wield influence. She promised to produce heirs and secure Spain's future. But once again, no children came. The same cycle of disappointment, blame, and despair returned. By the 1690s, superstition in Madrid reached fever pitch. Priests conducted exorcisms not only on Charles but even on the royal bedchamber itself. Candles burned at all hours. Relics of saints were carried into the palace, pressed against the king's frail body. At one point, Charles ordered his own body exhumed, not for burial, but for examination by priests who insisted his sickness came from enchantment. His hair and nails were cut, strange objects burned in rituals, and chants filled the air like desperate echoes of medieval faith. Even ambassadors from other courts wrote home in disbelief. Spain's monarch was no longer a ruler, but a frightened man trapped in rituals against shadows. By this time, Charles's reputation across Europe had hardened into legend. He was known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Foreign diplomats described him as more corpse than king, pale, drooling, often trembling, speaking of spirits and curses as though they were real. Satirical pamphlets mocked him. Cartoons depicted him chained by demons, led about by priests. To Spain's enemies, he was proof that the Hapsburg line had rotted from within. To his own people, he was a tragic figure, pitted, feared, and revered all at once. Thus, the years of wives, curses, and superstition passed like shadows over the throne of Spain. 2 marriages had failed, heirs had not been born, and the rituals of faith had not lifted the supposed curse. Spain was a kingdom ruled by fear of witches, fear of decline, fear of a future without a Habsburg king. And at the center of it stood Charles II, the monarch who had come to believe that his crown was bound not by gold, but by enchantment. By the 1690s, the Spanish Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its maps still sprawled across oceans, with colonies in the Americas, possessions in Italy, and territories in the Low Countries. But these dominions drained more than they enriched. Silver fleets from the New World brought treasure, yet much of it was spent repaying debts to bankers in Genoa and Amsterdam. Spain, once the richest nation in Christendom, found its coffers hollow and its armies thin. The empire was too vast for a king who could barely stand. Wars that had once been fought in glory were now fought in desperation. Spain clung to its possessions in the Low Countries, resisting French advances under Louis XIV. Armies were raised, but soldiers went unpaid. Supplies dwindled, fortresses crumbled, and victories grew rare. In the Mediterranean, pirates threatened Spain's ships. In the Americas, colonies resisted taxation and governance from afar. Each front demanded strength, yet Madrid had none to give. Charles II, increasingly ill, could not lead his armies. Generals wrote reports, Ministers argued strategies. But in the end, Spain's campaigns became exercises in survival rather than triumph. Even within the heart of Madrid, decline was visible. The royal palace grew cold, corridors unheated, tapestries fraying. Courtiers complained of unpaid salaries. Servants whispered of shortages even in the kitchens of the king. Charles II, too weak to notice, lived amid rituals and medicines. But others saw it clearly. The Spanish crown was no longer a source of wealth, but of poverty. Foreign ambassadors recorded with astonishment how little grandeur remained in a court that had once dazzled Europe. The mighty palace had become a theater of faded glory. With Charles ever weaker, his second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, took a commanding role. Strong-willed and ambitious, she placed her German relatives into positions of influence. She corresponded with foreign courts, built alliances, and sought to maintain her power should her husband die. But her presence deepened divisions at court. Spanish nobles resented her German advisors. Factions grew bitter. Some wanted the Austrian Hapsburgs to inherit the throne. Others leaned toward France's Bourbons. The king, meanwhile, sat silent, often staring blankly as debates raged around him. His body was frail, his mind clouded. His wife and ministers ruled in his stead. All of Europe watched Spain, waiting for Charles to die. The question of his successor became the central issue of European politics. Would Spain fall to the Austrian Hapsburgs, keeping the dynasty intact? Or would the Bourbons of France inherit, placing Spain under the influence of Louis XIV? Diplomatic intrigue filled the court. Ambassadors bribed ministers, factions spread rumors, and alliances shifted daily. Charles himself, childless and ill, was both king and pawn in this great game of succession. Every day his weakness deepened the urgency. Every night Europe wondered how much longer he would live. Charles's health, never strong, now collapsed entirely. He suffered convulsions, ulcers, fevers, and endless pain. He could not chew food properly, his jaw weak and misshapen. At times he could barely walk. At others he lay bedridden, gasping for breath. Physicians, bewildered, prescribed contradictory remedies. Some bled him, others purged him, others pressed holy relics to his body. Charles obeyed them all, but nothing helped. By the late 1690s, courtiers avoided describing him in their letters. He was no longer kingly, barely even human, more like a shadow drifting through his own palace. Though Spain still bore the title of empire, it had become more performance than reality. Ceremonies continued, processions, feast days, religious rituals, but they felt hollow. Citizens cheered, priests intoned blessings, banners waved in plazas. Yet everyone knew the empire was dying. Charles appeared rarely, and when he did, he was so pale, so fragile, that crowds murmured prayers rather than cheers. His reign was not one of triumph, but of pity. Spain had once marched across Europe with fire and steel. Now it limped forward, guided by tradition and fear of what would come next. In villages and towns, Spain's decline was deeply felt. Taxes rose, harvests failed, trade dwindled. Peasants prayed for relief, soldiers begged for pay, merchants turned to smuggling to survive. All the while, the people whispered of their king, the bewitched monarch, the cursed ruler. Some pitied him, others feared him, but none believed he could save them. His weakness mirrored their own despair. The kingdom carried on, but without hope. Each passing year was not a march forward, but a slow surrender to decay. Thus, Spain in the 1690s stood on the brink of ruin. Its empire was too vast to manage, its armies too weak to fight, its treasury too empty to recover. At its heart sat Charles II, a king without strength, without heirs, and without hope. The court fractured into factions, the people suffered in silence, and Europe circled like vultures awaiting the inevitable. The slow collapse of Spain had become not only history but tragedy, played out under the reign of a man who could not escape the name that clung to him, the Bewitched King. By the year 1699, Charles II was 40 years old, though he looked decades older. His body, frail since birth, had wasted into a shell. His face was hollow, his skin pale as wax, and his jaw, deformed by generations of inbreeding, made eating almost impossible. Each autumn breeze seemed capable of toppling him. Ministers whispered that the king lived on borrowed time. Priests spoke of miracles, but even they doubted. The court moved silently, afraid each day might be the last of their sovereign. Illness consumed him. His stomach refused food. His legs trembled beneath him. His speech slurred beyond recognition. He spent hours in bed, trembling in fever, or sitting in chapels, whispering prayers for salvation. Exorcisms continued even in these final years. Priests anointed him with oils, burned incense, recited chants meant to drive out demons. Charles wept, convinced he was bewitched until the end. He feared not only death, but damnation. The King of Spain, once heir to an empire on which the sun never set, now clutched relics in his weak hands, praying only to be freed from invisible chains. Beyond his bedchamber, Europe grew restless. All knew Charles would leave no heir. The question of succession loomed heavier than his crown. On one side stood the Austrian Hapsburgs, determined to keep Spain within their dynasty. On the other stood the French Bourbons, led by Louis XIV, who dreamed of uniting France and Spain under his grandson. Ambassadors filled Madrid, bribing ministers, flattering Maria Anna, spreading rumors. Each faction claimed to serve Spain's best interest, but in truth they served their masters abroad. The king's silence became the silence of a nation on the brink. In October 1700, Charles summoned his remaining strength. With trembling hands, he signed his final will. Against his wife's wishes, against Austrian hopes, he left the entire Spanish crown to Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France. He wrote that Spain must remain whole, not divided among rival claimants. Only a single heir could preserve the empire, even if it meant giving it to a Bourbon. The decision sent shockwaves across Europe. The death of one man would unleash a war that would consume nations. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died in Madrid at the age of 39. His body, broken by disease and the weight of his lineage, finally gave out. Those who attended him said he passed with fear in his eyes, whispering prayers to the Virgin. His reign, long yet empty, ended not with triumph, but with silence. The last Hapsburg of Spain was gone. With him, an era collapsed. His death did not bring peace. Instead, it lit the fuse of the War of the Spanish Succession. France claimed Spain through Philip of Anjou, now King Philip V. Austria refused to accept it. England, the Dutch Republic, and other powers joined the struggle, fearing a Bourbon empire too vast to contain. For over a decade, Europe burned in battlefields from Italy to the Low Countries, from the seas of the Mediterranean to the hills of Spain itself. The war claimed countless lives, all from the frail hand of the bewitched king who left no heir. After his death, physicians performed an autopsy on Charles's body. What they reported stunned even a world accustomed to superstition. They claimed his body was filled with water, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, and his head filled with fluid. They whispered that he had no blood, only phlegm. To many, it was proof of his curse. To others, it was the tragic end of generations of inbreeding. The king who had been called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was seen as neither ruler nor man, but a symbol of decay. Charles II left no victories, no heirs, no glory. His reign was one of sorrow, superstition, and decline. Yet in his frailty, he embodied the tragedy of a dynasty that had stretched itself too far, too long. He was not a tyrant, nor a villain. He was a man born into a crown too heavy, a kingdom too vast, and a body too weak. His life was less a reign than a burden carried in trembling silence. Spain survived, reshaped by war. But the name of Charles II endured in whispers, the bewitched king, last of the Spanish Hapsburgs. And so ends the story of Charles II, a king who could not rule, a man trapped between superstition and history, a monarch whose death unraveled Europe into war. His was a life both pitied and feared, remembered not for deeds accomplished but for the tragedy of weakness. The candles of his reign burned low, flickered, and went out, leaving Spain in darkness and Europe in flames.